make our planet great again.
Nuclear energy is expensive, whereas photovoltaic, hydraulic and wind powers are much cheaper.
Having small renewable power stations in lots of different locations, in villages and whatnot, it's a good way to build energy resilience.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of France in Focus. I'm Haxie Myers-Belkin. A key part of the fight against global warming is the idea of carbon neutrality, that is, net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Like many countries and institutions around the world, France has committed to going carbon neutral by 2050. So how exactly is it planning on getting there, and crucially, how's it going so far?
France is lagging behind on its environmental goals. That's a verdict of the country's High Council on Climate, which says the current reforms won't be adequate to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Today, 63% of energy used in France is produced by fossil fuels, meaning coal, petrol and gas, which all contribute to CO2 emissions. Transport is responsible for 31% of CO2 emissions, with more than half of that down to cars. Some progress has been made. CO2 produced in France dropped by 9.2% in 2020, but that result is in large part due to the mandatory COVID lockdowns. The same year, electricity production fell by 7%, to a record low level for 20 years. For the first time, wind power overtook solar energy as the third highest source of energy produced in the country. The overall production of renewable energy is increasing, up 8.4% for hydroelectricity and 2.3% for solar. But it's still not enough to reach the targets. According to the High Council on Climate, 2 out of 3 French people are already exposed to risks due to climate change.
Currently, France derives 70% of its energy from nuclear power, making the country the world's largest consumer of nuclear per capita. The French government insists that nuclear is a key part of the carbon neutrality puzzle and has promised to invest €1 billion in nuclear by the end of the decade. But not everyone's on the same page.
No country in the world is as reliant on nuclear power as France. And 6 months before the presidential election, Emmanuel Macron has cast it in a starring role in his 10-year investment plan, aiming to build next-generation small modular reactors.
We must prepare ourselves for breakthrough technologies and transformations in nuclear. We will invest €1 billion between now and 2030.
10 days after this announcement, Green Party candidate Yannick Jadot appeared atop a turbine.
I'm here today on a wind farm mast to say how much we love wind energy.
For him, the wind is a stronger choice than the atom.
The president forces French people to overconsume energy to justify the choice of nuclear energy, which is risky.
Celui du nucléaire, qui est un choix risqué.
The Greens and some other left-wing parties are against nuclear power, but they're very much in the minority. For most French politicians, nuclear guarantees the country's energy independence while keeping the energy grid low in carbon and the skies clear of pollution. Many specialists are now recommending nuclear as a stopgap towards a totally renewable future.
The scenario which ticks the most boxes, emits the least CO2, is the least expensive and requires the least new infrastructure, is the scenario with more nuclear energy.
Anti-nuclear activists, meanwhile, raise questions about possible accidents and the treatment of waste. But they also don't think nuclear energy can be ramped up quick enough to deal with the climate emergency.
The EU's aim is to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. It takes at least 15 years to build a nuclear reactor, if not longer. So nuclear is not even an option for this 2030 goal.
This hasn't stopped the French government from lobbying EU institutions. Soon, the European Commission is expected to issue a climate taxonomy, For this new classification, France is leading a group of 10 countries who are calling for nuclear to be labelled as green.
To discuss the future of energy here in France, I'm joined now by sociologist Michel Vieviorca. Thank you for speaking to us here on France 24 today.
It's my pleasure.
Now, we are, of course, just months away from the first round of the French presidential election, and energy is going to be a central theme in the run-up to this election. Why is energy provision such a political issue here in France?
First of all, because it's a question of cost. Energy is rising, the costs are rising, and there is suddenly a big debate, should we or not accept nuclear energy in a context when carbon is a big issue and in a context when gas and oil are very expensive. What should we do? So you have a certain number of people that say we should stop, we should finish with nuclear energy. And on the other hand, people say, look, if France is so successful as far as energy is at stake, in this country, we never lacked energy during the last 30 or 40 years. If we have been able to be more or less independent, it is due to nuclear energy. So there is not a real debate, but you have different positions in the general atmosphere.
I'd like to talk a bit more about renewable energy here in France. Do you think that French citizens are in some way wary of that switch to renewable energies, more so than maybe their European neighbours?
Well, it's difficult to give a precise answer because some people say, well, I am happy with energy like that. I don't pay too much. When I need electricity, I have electricity and it's okay. But then you have other people that say, no, look at the climate change. Look at all these big issues. We need absolutely to finish with oil and with gas. But you have also people that say nuclear is dangerous. Nuclear, we don't know what to do with nuclear waste. Exactly. So you have different people, and sometimes the same persons don't know very well what to think. But today, in a country when many people say, I have problems with money, I don't make money enough, life is too difficult, people say, oh, I don't want to pay more for my energy. And don't forget also sometimes, we are discussing nuclear energy, but at the same time we are discussing mobility. In this country, we had a social movement 3 years ago, the famous Gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets. And these people were saying we need cheap gas in order to go to work and to live, because everybody does not live in the center of Paris where you don't need a car. So this issue of energy, when you discuss nuclear energy, you don't take seriously into account this issue of mobility, which is also a key issue in the French debate.
And that leads me on to a question about energy consumption. Of course, this debate has two sides. There's energy production and energy consumption. Is France as a whole, do you think, ready to drastically reduce the amount of energy it requires? Are people ready to make that sacrifice?
Young people are more and more willing to go in this direction. But many people also say, well, I want to live as I used to do. I want to have access to my car. I want to have access to gas, oil, and as much as necessary in my house. But the general tendency is to take very seriously the climate change and to accept the idea that you can have the same quality of life with less energy.
And do you believe that France will be able to go carbon neutral by 2050?
I would love this, and maybe earlier if possible. So it's a question of political pressure. And I am on the side of those people that say there should be more pressure so that we can succeed and be ready after 30 years.
That brings us to the end of this week's edition of France in Focus. Thank you very much for watching. See you again next week.